Minister knows that free childcare isn't available in Northern Ireland, but is he aware of the serious consequences this is having on people throughout the North, particularly women? Childcare is extremely expensive in Northern Ireland, the most expensive outside of London. So something really needs to be done. But rather than tell me that this is just a matter for the executive, which isn't even sitting, what is he doing right now to secure free childcare for the women in Northern Ireland? And who is he speaking to about it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that she doesn't mean to implore me to ride roughshod over the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but we do need to abide by the devolution settlement that is in there. But what I would say is that Northern Ireland does have its own childcare system, and it is the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive and Northern Ireland Department of Education to put in place those much-needed policies for childcare support. And of course, she's quite right to raise them. Successive executives have not prioritised funding for equivalent childcare provision to England, despite having funding through Barnett consequentials to do so. And I hope she will join with me in saying to an executive, which of course we hope will be restored, that they really do need to take care of childcare.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Prime Minister's number 10 Instagram account celebrated Northern Ireland's business with the Irish tricolour on a recent post this week, does the Minister think parents would get a better child deal with the Republic?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I feel confident that somewhere there is a junior communications professional lamenting that they accepted the automatically generated flag on that Instagram posting, and I don't wish to deepen their embarrassment by going further. He will have noticed that on my own Instagram I was proud to put out this particular lapel pin that I'm wearing.
Andrew Slew.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I may, yesterday was the 49th anniversary of the Birmingham pub bombings that killed 21 people and injured 182, the deadliest act of terrorism in England in the Troubles. We should remember those that lost their lives at this juncture. And in this 25th year of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it's important to remind ourselves of the progress that has been made since 1998. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 2 and 6 together. I recently attended a roundtable with the Northern Ireland Institute of Directors and meet regularly with Northern Ireland businesses to discuss a whole range of issues, including the Windsor Framework. Officials across the UK Government are also in regular contact with businesses on the implementation of the framework, and we've continued the ongoing implementation of the Windsor Framework, rolling out the first phase of the Green Lane on the 1st of October, cutting red tape and lifting bans on everyday products.
Slow.
Well, I very much welcome the Secretary of State's commitment to businesses in Northern Ireland. Could he tell the House how many of them are now registered with the UK Internal Market Scheme?
Secretary of State.
Yeah, I thank him for his question, because I'm happy to confirm that more than 7,000 businesses have now registered with the UK Internal Market Scheme, of which over 3,000 are businesses that did not benefit from the previous schemes, and all which now can move their goods free from costly any sort of issues and tariffs. Businesses registered under the scheme will also, in the future, be able to avoid completing customs declarations as we continue implementation of the framework.
Jonathan Gillis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State accept that for as long as there are customs declarations, physical searches and ID checks from businesses moving goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, even in the Green Lane, that the Prime Minister's view of there being no sense of a border in the Irish Sea will ring hollow?
I'm afraid, with the greatest respect to the honourable gentleman, I do not accept that. When we agreed to the Windsor Framework, we committed to a certain number of EU laws being maintained in Northern Ireland, which has been of economic benefit to Northern Ireland even up to this point, and will continue to be in the future. But for movements coming across the Irish Sea, I think pretty much everybody involved, the businesses involved, the new businesses using them, believe they are simple and very straightforward.
Jeffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that excellent question, our objective is to ensure that Northern Ireland's place in our biggest market, the United Kingdom, is restored and protected in law. Will the Secretary of State work with us to ensure that where goods are moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, they are not subject to EU customs processes that are neither necessary or fair or right, and that save for animal health and the risk of smuggling, that there should not be checks on those goods.
Secretary of State.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question, and I very much enjoy working with him on a regular basis to try and achieve the aims that he has put out. I would say that we have gone a long way in the Windsor framework in this space so far, but I look forward to continued engagement with him in the next few days, because we do need to find a resolution to these issues that also means that we can reform Stormont and deal with other domestic issues in Northern Ireland.
Jeffrey.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for the additional support that has been provided to businesses affected by flooding in Northern Ireland? And will the Secretary of State work with us to ensure that whatever additional support is required for the recovery of towns like Downpatrick and Newry and Portadown, that it is delivered by the Northern Ireland departments working together with the Northern Ireland office?
Secretary of State.
And if I may, I'd like to, if I can, thank the local councils and the Northern Ireland Civil Service for the work they've done on this so far. I mean, the flooding, which I know we'll talk about in questions a bit later, was extraordinary, and so many people were affected and didn't expect to be. £15 million has been assigned for this at this point in time, but he's quite right to say that the consequences of these floods will have ramifications for months and years to come.
Barishan.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland has outstanding universities, and a high share of its population is educated to degree level. My ministerial colleagues and I have the pleasure of regularly engaging with Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, and we're proud to promote these institutions in the UK and internationally. I have glanced at the rankings to which the honourable gentleman refers. I'm looking forward to hearing his further question.
Where is Sherman?
Mr. Speaker, is the Minister aware that I was speaking on the deck of the Titanic Centre only 2 weeks ago, and I was thinking about him and the Conservative government? But is he aware that I was also speaking to universities and local businesses deeply worried about the inability of universities and business to get answers from the government to enable them to meet the targets of the very important impact assessment under the United Nations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as keen as I am to keep abreast of the honourable gentleman's thoughts, I was not aware that he had those particular insights on those particular occasions. Of course, we do continue to work with the universities and Northern Ireland Civil Service. I'm keen to work with him on the success of those universities. But what, of course, we need above all is an executive to return so we can work through some of the issues before us.
Teresa Villiers.
Staff and students at Queen's University Belfast are doing some incredibly impressive work on cybersecurity. So what can ministers do to ensure that that expertise is deployed to make us a more cyber resilient nation?
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend, and I had the pleasure of visiting the National Centre for Cybersecurity, Secure IT, and I had a particularly interesting time testing some of their systems, but I don't think I should comment any further on that particular experience. But we always are keen to promote their work. I'm grateful to her for giving me the opportunity to say on the record they do a fantastic job, and together with the National Centre for Cybersecurity, I'm sure they will continue to promote cybersecurity in the UK and indeed abroad.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll answer questions 4, 5 and 9 together. Northern Ireland's finances are, I'm sorry to say, unsustainable, and departments are facing difficult decisions to live within their budgets. This is why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has directed departments using powers under the Northern Ireland Interim Arrangements Act 2023 to launch public consultations on measures to support budget sustainability and raise more revenue.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. The Prime Minister announced on Monday that one of his 5 new key priorities is to improve education across these islands, yet at the same time his government is starving Northern Ireland's Education Department of £300 million. Now, we all know the government love fantasy economics, but surely the idea that cutting £300 million from education will improve it is a flight of fancy even too far for this government.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend the Prime Minister is absolutely right when he said that education is the closest thing we have in public policy to a silver bullet. But I'd just say to the honourable gentleman opposite that the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council has acknowledged that Northern Ireland is currently receiving the funding it needs through a combination of Northern Ireland Block Grant, locally generated revenue and additional UK government funding packages. Those additional packages amount to some £7 billion in additional funding since 2014. I'm afraid the reality is for schools in Northern Ireland, they're long overdue reform. The cost of running a divided education system is very considerable. What we need to do is see much more integrated education, much more efficiency, and make sure that children get the educations that they richly deserve.
Kirsten Oswald.
Mr Speaker, recent analysis has actually shown that Northern Ireland's budget over the past 3 years has been cut by £2.3 billion in real terms. So on top of that slow decline, the UK government has withheld millions in funding, forcing budget cuts on Northern Ireland departments. So why does he think it's okay to punish the people of Northern Ireland for the political impasse of their representatives?
Well, of course, it's not our view that the people are being punished for an impasse. The reality is that the budget situation is very difficult for all the devolved nations, and she will know that in Northern Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland, difficult decisions have to be taken to live within our means. And this government is trying to take is taking the necessary steps to assist the executive in balancing the books.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Whoever it is that is responsible for the current stalemate in Northern Ireland, it's not the young people in the country's schools.
Hear, hear.
My honourable friend has pointed to the desperate shortfall of funding. Is the Minister aware that teachers in Northern Ireland haven't had a pay increase for 3 years? So effectively they've taken a pay cut that is now over 20%. Could you explain how that is going to help to maintain the proud record of education in Northern Ireland that he spoke about a few minutes ago?
Well, I'm grateful to him, and I can assure him that teachers have not hesitated to impress that point upon me when I've been in Northern Ireland. It is a matter that, of course, we have under active consideration, but I'm not able to satisfy him today.
Sir Robert Butland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My honourable friends mentioned additional UK government funding, and an important element of that is levelling up bids. We note with concern that on the Northern Ireland Committee that no Northern Ireland application was successful in the recent third phase. Can he assure me that a sum of funding is being set aside for Northern Ireland projects, and if so, can he give us an indication as to the likely amount being set aside?
My right honourable friend is right to highlight this issue. A number of things have been said about this matter which are not the case. The money is going to be made available in Northern Ireland. It has been set aside. If memory serves, it's about £15 million, but I would need to double check. If I'm incorrect, I'll write to him. That money will be made available in Northern Ireland. But the reality is we need decisions to be taken by a restored executive, and the government is keen to work with Northern Ireland ministers to that end. But I'm grateful to him for highlighting this point, giving me the opportunity to say the money will be spent in Northern Ireland.
Shadow Minister Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following on from that question, communities across Northern Ireland are angry about the government's decision to exclude them from the latest round of levelling up funding. The government has said this is because Stormont isn't sitting, but this is a poor excuse, Mr Speaker, because round 2 funding was allocated to 10 projects in Northern Ireland in January this year when the executive wasn't in place as well. Only 120 million out of the pot of 5 billion has been allocated to Northern Ireland so far. There's a huge additional need in communities, but millions are being held back, as the Minister has just said. So, will the Secretary of State now commit to reversing this unjust decision with immediate effect?
Well, she makes her point, of course, with great force, but as I just said to my right honourable friend, the money will be spent in Northern Ireland, but we are very keen indeed to work with Northern Ireland ministers to this effect. And what I would say, when it comes to the overall level of money that's required, she'll know that we've just put over £700 million into Peace Plus, which will help support Northern Ireland working. Well, the reality is we are working hard to make sure that Northern Ireland has the funding that it needs, but really to sort out the problems Northern Ireland faces, we need a restored executive, we need, I'm afraid, revenue raising, and we need to be working with Northern Ireland ministers to make sure we get the public service reform that is so urgently needed.
SNP spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I associate myself with the remarks made by the Secretary of State on the anniversary of the Birmingham pub bombings, and our thoughts continue to be with all who are affected by that tragedy to this day. The UK Government, as we've just heard, is holding back levelling up fundings for Northern Ireland, ostensibly because of the lack of a functioning executive. Yet where there are governments in place in Edinburgh and in Cardiff, the UK Government is quite content, seemingly, to bypass the views of those governments in allocating levelling up funding. As a point of consistency, not this. It's not about a desire to level up. There's just a shortage of Conservative MPs in Northern Ireland who require to get their re-election prospects shored up with public cash.
Minister.
I mean, it's easy to throw out a cheap political line like that, but as he's heard me say to my right honourable friend and to the honourable lady opposite, the reality is that that levelling up money will be spent in Northern Ireland. I can certainly assure him that none of that money has appeared in my marginal seat of Wickham, even as, Mr Speaker, the whole House will know it is undoubtedly the most deserving and most beautiful constituency in the nation.
Curran McCarthy.
Question 7, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the floods have seen devastating consequences for businesses and households, so the government has worked hard to come forward with a substantial package that is consistent with our approach across the UK. In the absence of an executive, we're making up to £15 million of support available through the reallocation of existing Northern Ireland funding. We've worked closely with colleagues in the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the Treasury to ensure that Northern Ireland Civil Service and local councils can provide affected businesses with the support they need.
Curran McCarthy.
Thank the Minister for that response. He will know that there are real concerns about whether that funding is adequate, and I think he'll hear about that in a moment. But can I ask about future adaptation and prevention? Because we know that often it's talked about as though such floods are a once-in-a-century, a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but we know from England that that is not the case, and that the communities will need protection from future occurrences too.
She's absolutely right to raise this. Of course, she'll know that these matters are mostly for the Department for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland. This is why we're so keen to get the finances on a sustainable basis and achieve the long-term change that is needed. And that, of course, includes having a strategic plan for adaptation. She's absolutely right to raise it, and I very much hope to have the opportunity in this role to work with the Northern Ireland Executive to the end that she raises.
Shadow Secretary of State Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I begin by joining the Secretary of State in his remarks about all those who lost their lives in the terrible Birmingham pub bombings. We remember them. Last week in Downpatrick, Newry and Portadown, I saw the terrible effects of the flooding on businesses and households, many of whom can't get flood insurance and therefore face huge losses. Once the initial £7,500 has been paid out to all the businesses from the money the Secretary of State announced during his visit, can the Minister assure us that the Treasury will approve proposals for the use of the rest of the money quickly so that businesses affected can receive help and get back up and running again? And if more is needed, will he provide it?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, the rest of the money is within the power of the Northern Ireland Civil Service to spend because it is reallocated funding. But alas, the Treasury is not under my control, but all I can say is I look forward to the day.
Hilary Benn.
Well, I thank the Minister for that answer, and the traders will expect to see the money spent. There's going to have to be a review of what happened during the floods to learn lessons for the future. Things like the need for a warning system, which there isn't in Northern Ireland currently, better flood defences and flood protection, which will all need funding in the years ahead. But in the continuing absence of the executive, which is really needed at a time like this, does the Minister agree that there should be a review? Does the Northern Ireland Civil Service have the power to establish such a review? And if not, will the Secretary of State do it?
Well, Mr Speaker, I would agree with the right honourable gentleman that a review is needed. I believe that it is possible for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to get on with that work under the powers we've given him. If it transpires that that's not the case, of course I'll write to him and put a copy of the letter in the library. But I do believe that it is within their powers to get on with it. But if I may say so finally, of course he's absolutely right. We all want to work together to see a restored executive, because it is for Northern Ireland ministers to work with their own Department for Infrastructure to deal with these matters, but of course the insights he provides are wise and necessary.
Farrell.
Question here, please, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for the proposals he and his party, and the proposals that the honourable member for Belfast East has already shared with me regarding these matters. I actually read his article in the Irish Times early this morning with great interest, but he will know that this sort of change is not exactly the silver bullet and will need some negotiation.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that there is a need for negotiation. The fiscal floor is of vital importance to Northern Ireland. Can I ask the Secretary of State to ensure that any fiscal floor is driven by evidence, is based on the work of the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, draws on the work of Professor Holtham in Wales, and properly reflects the devolution of policing and justice, as what happened in 2010 around Need?
Yeah, I thank him for those points, and obviously there's always some debate on what the basis of need is, and the Fiscal Council outlined what it should be in their particular eyes. In general principles, the answer is yes. There is a lot of conversations to be had here, and the Fiscal Council has helpfully published a report earlier this year. But I do remind him that this proposal for Wales took over 7 years to negotiate.
Ian Paisley.
Bingo. Mr. Speaker, just to update the House, Sir Declan Morgan and Peter Sheridan have been identified as Chief Commissioner Designate and Commissioner for Investigations Designate respectively. Sir Declan commenced work in June and Peter Sheridan is due to start in December. Formal appointments will only take place once the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery is legally established. The Commissioner Designate and I have been in contact about a range of issues, mainly through correspondence, including in leading the search for remaining commissioners.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will take the opportunity to raise the numerous crimes committed in the Republic of Ireland against Northern Ireland and to challenge them over state-sponsored terrorism there when those meetings finally take place. On the issue of his numerous meetings, I believe dozens of meetings now with Sinn Féin, can the Secretary of State explain to the House if he has taken the opportunity to challenge Sinn Féin about their boycott of the institutions here, and when is he asking them to come back here and do their job here?
Mr. Speaker, I meet with all the political parties, as you would expect me to, and their party leaders in Northern Ireland, and indeed here where their party leaders exist. Everybody knows the views of this government about people who do not turn up and take the oath in this place, but I do have to work with all parties and will continue to do so as we move forward.
Jim Shannon.
Question number 12.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, pay policy in Northern Ireland is a devolved matter, and it's not for the government to be making these decisions. I'm sure the honourable gentleman would agree with me that decisions on these matters should be made by a Northern Ireland executive with ministers returned.
Shannon.
I know the Minister for State for Northern Ireland has a deep interest in the affairs of Northern Ireland, but also when it comes to wages for classroom assistants. Only last week, thousands of non-teaching staff have gone on strike from Northern Ireland schools. This action was called over an escalating row over pay, where thousands of people walked out. Will the Minister of State commit to investigating this in terms of the Barnett consequential as a way forward to ascertain what can be done to support teaching assistants in Northern Ireland? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to him for raising this issue. I can tell him that we're actively considering representations made by trade unions. He raises a very, very important point, and as I say, I know he understands it is a matter for the executive, and I hope that he and I one day will be able to celebrate some progress on these issues.
On the outset.
Question 13, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 13 and 14 together in my beautifully tabulated pack. Our focus remains on delivering for the people of Northern Ireland who expect and deserve locally elected decision makers to address the issues that matter to them. I will continue to engage regularly with the party leaders and believe there is genuine willingness on all sides to re-establish the conditions for the devolved institutions to go back to work and to thrive.
Tony on the outset.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard in this House today how disappointed Northern Ireland is with no levelling up bids. I visited Coleraine Football Club and they were disappointed. They were unsuccessful in round 2. So can the Secretary of State tell me, is he confident that the restoration of power sharing is close because Northern Ireland simply cannot afford to lose out on even more money?
I'm glad she went to Coleraine Football Club. I went there and had a wonderful experience with a great football team. I'd have loved to have refereed personally, but it's just the way it was. I wasn't allowed to do that. But absolutely, I do believe we are moving closer to a decision point. But there are still continued discussions to be had, and they are continuing at pace, but at length.
Sir Robert Goodwill.
We've already heard today examples of how the people of Northern Ireland are disadvantaged by the lack of a functioning executive, and I would add to that list the deployment of the apprenticeship levy and reform of the renewable heat incentive. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that civil servants in Northern Ireland face an almost impossible job in trying to steer the ship of state without coordinates set by the politicians elected there?
True state.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question and his obvious popularity in the House. I obviously agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman. He is completely correct. There are a whole host of issues that actually do require elected ministers in Northern Ireland to take their place and take. But I'd like to place on record my thanks to the Northern Ireland Civil Service for the work they've been doing in such circumstances with the limited guidance we've given them, because they have been doing a sterling job on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Kirstin Oswald.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with the family and friends of the 4 teenagers who died in a car accident in North Wales. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but let me just say we welcome the agreement reached overnight for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. This is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial step towards ending the nightmare for families of those taken hostage in Hamas's terror attack, and also addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Kirstin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, his government will say that disabled people have a duty to work from home or lose their benefits, as if a suitable job of this kind is something that can be conjured up at will. It should be obvious to anyone that this kind of punitive policy isn't incentivising work, it's simply punishing disabled people who are already among the most marginalised in our communities. So can the Prime Minister do his duty and tell us now how many of the 137,000 jobs on the DWP Find a Job website are roles which specify that you can work from home?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right to preempt the Chancellor's autumn statement later, but let me just say this. I'm proud of this government's record in supporting those with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, not only have we closed the disability employment gap, not only have we increased the number of employers that are now disability confident, we're also making sure that we support those who are most vulnerable in our society, not least with the cost of living payments this year, which include £150 for all those on means-tested disability benefits.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that the measures taken to get us through the economic shocks caused by COVID and Putin's war were right for that time, but they are not the blueprint for the long-term successful economies of the future? Yeah. It's innovation and skills and investment in these, such as the imminent rebuild of Harrogate College or the 12,000 local apprenticeships we've seen since 2010. These are our foundation, and not the fantasy fairy tale tens of billions of borrowing from the Labour Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right, and I'm proud that since 2010 we've created 5.5 million apprenticeships. And Mr. Speaker, that's the difference between us. We now know that the party opposite want to halve the number of apprenticeships if they were in office. Meanwhile, we want to make an apprentice education secretary. But my honourable friend is right. Labour's plans to borrow £28 billion a year would just push up inflation, interest rates and taxes, undermining all the progress that we've made on the economy. And it's only the Conservatives that will give people the opportunity to build wealthier, more secure lives for them and their families.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the Prime Minister, I know the whole House will welcome the agreement reached overnight. We repeat our calls for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. This humanitarian pause must be used to get the hostages out safely, to tackle the urgent and unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to make progress to a full cessation of hostilities. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the international community has treated the two-state solution as a slogan rather than a serious strategy, and that must now change. Like the Prime Minister, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House in saying our hearts go out to the families and friends of the 4 young men from Shrewsbury who tragically lost their lives this week. It's a living nightmare for any parent, and I can hardly begin to imagine their loss. Mr. Speaker, this week the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history. But I'm pleased he mentioned the 5 pledges because, as he knows, 3 of them are economic, and on a day which we will focus on the economy, I'm pleased to report that we have indeed halved inflation, no thanks to the party opposite. We have indeed grown the economy, and we have indeed reduced debt. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Well, the reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago. And the Prime Minister just claimed that this is all about economic growth. So let me ask him, if a labourer or a care worker is forced to wait a year for an operation, how are they meant to help grow the economy?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. But, Mr. Speaker, I talked about the practical things that we are doing with CDCs and surgical hubs. But he doesn't also seem to realise that the union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of Parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
So raising the waiting list by 500,000 is getting things done. He's through the looking glass, this one. I asked the Prime Minister how many people are waiting for mental health treatment. He knows the answer, he just doesn't want to give it. 1.2 million. 200,000 are children, some waiting nearly 2 years to be seen. Would the Prime Minister accept those kind of delays if it were one of his family or friends?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we are doing to bring down waiting lists is to expand the access of patient choice. It's a very straightforward idea to make sure that patients can choose where they get treated, and that way we will bring down waiting lists for mental health and other treatments far faster. Now, the Labour Party's policy on this is a total and utter mess. First, he promised, in his words, to ban NHS use of the independent sector. Then he said he wants more use of the independent sector. His shadow health secretary agreed with that, but then the deputy leader said that she would end it. As ever, you simply don't know what they stand for, and you can't trust a word they say.
As ever, no responsibility for the shocking state of the NHS. The truth is, the Prime Minister would not accept those weights for his family, and neither should anyone else. This morning, I spoke to an NHS nurse. For many months, Cam struggled to find time to see her 14-year-old son, Mikey, until he became seriously unwell. And now he hasn't been able to be in mainstream education for over a year. Mikey's mum is having to balance nursing with caring and being a parent. And this isn't a one-off. There are families up and down the country in exactly the same situation, working hard, trying to get through the cost of living crisis whilst desperately worried about relatives who can't get the treatment they need. How does he think they feel when they see the Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility and boasting that everything is fine?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing absolutely everything we can to put money into the NHS to bring down the waiting list, because I do want families up and down the country to have access to the healthcare that they need. He's absolutely right, they do deserve it. But then it is incredibly galling, Mr. Speaker, to hear this from someone who, when there are strikes happening in our hospitals and people are being denied access to emergency medical care, not only does he not have the strength to condemn it, he refuses to back legislation that would guarantee all the families that he talked about that access.
This is on his watch. It's his responsibility. 13 years in, and all he's got to offer is trying to blame the opposition for his failures. Over and over again. Mikey's mum. I'll tell you what Mikey's mum said to me this morning, shall I, if you're so interested to hear. She said, and I'm going to quote her, she said, whatever spin the government puts on it, you can't hide the reality for ordinary working people. That's her words. Worth reflecting on. Yes. Now, I'm glad that in recent years, real progress has been made in tackling the stigma surrounding mental health. But the fact remains that the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has doubled since 2010, and suicide is now the biggest killer of men under 45. And they're not just statistics. Every single one is a tragic loss to families and to friends. Politics has the ability to turn this around. It means tough choices. If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work, back to their families, and, crucially, giving them their lives back. This is about mental health. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that, for the first time in the NHS's history, ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. And we can look, because he talks about records, Mr. Speaker, because this is something that no government has done in the past. It's something I'm proud we've done. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train. And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to housing that local people can afford is the biggest challenge we face in Cornwall. And whilst we need to build more houses, we need to ensure that they are available and affordable to local people and meet the needs of our rural and coastal communities. Now, local knowledge, particularly from elected representatives, is an important part in ensuring we achieve this. Yet the Leader of the Opposition has made clear that his intention is to ignore or override the views of local people in decisions on planning matters. Can the Prime Minister assure me and the people of Cornwall that under his government the views of local communities will play a part in the planning process?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents, and I agree with him that housing must meet the needs of local communities, and our Affordable Homes programme is delivering hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. But crucially, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe that local communities must be consulted. In contrast to Labour's plan, which is top-down housing targets, concreting over the Greenbelt and destroying our precious countryside.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us in the Chamber are united in our relief at reports that hostages are due to be released by Hamas in Gaza. But we can't afford to lose sight of what comes at the other side of the temporary pause in hostilities that we are about to see. At the end of 4 days, do we simply see the return to the killing of children in Gaza every 10 minutes? Or do we choose in this House to instead back a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do welcome the agreement reached overnight, and as I said, this is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial first step as we try and resolve this situation and indeed the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, we want to see all hostages released as quickly as possible, including British nationals, and I would urge all parties involved to deliver the agreement in full. I would also like to put on record my thanks to Qatar for their important role, and we will continue to work with the United States and Israel to ensure the safe return of hostages and maximise the opportunity of this temporary pause to step up aid to suffering civilians in Gaza. It is something that we have pushed for, we've continued to do, and the UK is playing a leading role in delivering.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, ultimately it's not a pause in the killing of children that we need. It is an end to the killing of children that we need. And I can think of no better time than now for the Prime Minister to advocate for that permanent ceasefire. But given that he won't currently do that, will he instead lay the foundations for that two-state solution by finally recognising the state of Palestine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually what the agreement that has been reached demonstrates that it wasn't right to have a unilateral ceasefire, and what was right was to do, as we have done, consistently push for a pause that would allow not just for aid to reach people in Gaza who desperately need it, but also for hostages to be released. That is what we have pushed for, and I'm glad that that is now being delivered versus a unilateral ceasefire, which would have emboldened and strengthened Hamas. And our position on the Middle East peace process more broadly is clear. We do support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I've spoken to President Abbas and met with him to discuss this issue, and we are clear about strengthening the Palestinian Authority and reinvigorating efforts to find a two-state solution. And our long-standing position is that we would recognise the state of Palestine when it best serves the interests of peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's Network North project, which will see the full £1.7 billion put into the Midlands Rail Hub, which will reopen the central platforms at Kings Norton train station, which have been derelict for so long. And can I ask him to bring forward the cash so we can increase capacity on the line and improve journey times? And can he look at my campaign to extend the new Camp Hill line to Longbridge, which will open up access to the new Longbridge Business Park, which he visited earlier in the year, which will be bringing back manufacturing jobs to Longbridge for the first time since MG collapsed in 2005.
Well, I am pleased that my honourable friend's constituency will benefit from the decision on HS2 and benefit significantly from new Network North funding, an additional £1 billion to deliver the Midlands Rail Hub in full. And I know that decisions about Kings Norton are due to be made later this year, which should be good news to him. And the extension of the forthcoming Camp Hill line services between Birmingham and Kings Norton and Longridge will be assessed in due course as well. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm sure the Rail Minister keeps him up to date on progress.
Sybil Roberts.
All right, I'm sure the Prime Minister will join me and the communities that I represent in sending heartfelt sympathies to the families and friends grieving at the loss of 4 young men lost in a tragic accident in Carrickglanrothen this week. People in North Wales pay the highest standing charges on energy bills at £340 a year. That's a third more than London. That's despite having lower average incomes and people there living in older, poorly insulated houses. With a further increase in standing charges due next April, he must recognise that he can't leave this to Ofgem. Will his government, therefore, tackle unfair standing charges, and that before winter sets in?
Mr. Speaker, we have provided an extraordinary package of support for households across the country to help with energy bills, totalling almost £100 billion over the past year or two. The Ofgem price cap has also fallen to around £1,800 currently, and our price guarantee will remain in place till spring of next year, which will provide further protection for families. But crucially, the Chancellor announced previously that we have removed the premium paid by households using prepayment meters until the EPG ends, bringing their costs into line with those paid by comparable direct debit customers, and we continue to provide considerable support for vulnerable families throughout the winter with their energy bills.
Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Setting strategic aims for the Middle East requires us to be precise about the terms we use, and that includes the word peace. Peace is not just the absence of war or conflict, but the freedom from the fear of conflict or oppression or terror. Peace requires mutual respect, freedom from persecution, and living without fear of destitution. It comes with self-determination and liberation from arbitrary justice. It needs hope and dignity and enforceable rights. Does my right honourable friend agree that only when all the people of the Middle East can achieve all of these things can any of us talk about having achieved peace?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with my right honourable friend and thank him for what he says. And I know his advice will continue to be of value to the government as we find a way for a peaceful, more secure future for everyone living in the region.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish surcharge on energy, according to Ofgem, means that people in Scotland pay 50% more in standing charges than Londoners, despite exporting 3.2 million hours of electricity to England in the last 2 months alone. Meanwhile, Scottish green energy producers pay higher charges than English power companies to connect to the grid. Does the Prime Minister think that this is fair to Scotland's consumers and businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I refer to my previous answer about the considerable support that we're providing to families across the United Kingdom with their energy bills. And actually, what would be good, she mentioned Scottish businesses, what would be good is if the SNP realised that they should support the 200,000 people employed in Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest film from Torquay's Unleashed theatre company, 3 Steps, outlines the impact of homelessness. What further steps does the government plan to take in order to ensure everyone has a place of their own?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the important work of his local theatre company, Unleashed, and I wish them well in their future endeavours. We are investing an unprecedented £2 billion over the next 3 years to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, including building thousands of move-on homes and implementing our landmark Homelessness Reduction Act, which has already prevented or relieved almost 600,000 households from suffering from homelessness.
Let's go to Cam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Why are 34% of children in my constituency living in poverty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this government that has ensured that across our country 1.7 million fewer people are living in poverty as a result of the actions of this government. Yes, that is true, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, hundreds of thousands fewer children are living in poverty, and income inequality is at a lower level than we inherited from the party opposite. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't want any child to grow up in poverty, and the best way to make sure that that happens is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. And that is why the right strategy is to ensure that we provide as many children with the opportunity to grow up with parents in work. And because of the actions of previous governments, several 100,000 more families are in that.
Got it. Durham Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question about apprenticeships. It is vital that individuals of any age can train and retrain for good local jobs, further education and skills opportunities that are available. So will the Prime Minister work with me in my campaign to establish an apprenticeship hub in Broxton?
Thank my honourable friend for all his campaigning on this important issue. We've delivered over 9,000 apprenticeships in his constituency, of great local businesses, including some that I visited as Chancellor, like Hair and Beauty from memory. But while we continue to invest in apprenticeships, we know the party opposite now want to halve that number, and that is the difference between us. Whilst on this side of the House we want to give people a hand up, all Labour want to do is keep them in their place.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With 316 arrivals by small boat this week, last week's Supreme Court ruling on Rwanda has left this government's lack of a compassionate and functioning asylum system totally exposed, with refugees suffering as a result and chaos at our borders. So could I ask the Prime Minister, yes or no, does he now intend to disapply human rights laws in order to continue wasting time and money on this cruel and discredited gimmick?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman mentioned the small boats arrivals. I'm pleased to tell him that thanks to the actions of this government, the number of arrivals are down by over 33% so far this year. No thanks to the party opposite that has opposed each and every single measure we have taken to stop the boats.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Labour leadership at Kirklees Council are looking to close Colne Valley Leisure Centre, hike up car parking charges and being criticised by their auditors for the way in which they manage their resources, there has been lots of good news for my bit of Yorkshire this week. £64 million of levelling up cash for Huddersfield Market and the Penistone rail line upgrade and the West Yorkshire Investment Zone, focusing on the National Health Innovation Campus at the University of Huddersfield. Will the Prime Minister continue to invest in West Yorkshire and come and see some of these fantastic...
Well, Mr. Speaker, what great news. What great news. I was delighted to hear that the third investment zone was announced in West Yorkshire, and indeed money for the Penistone Line rail upgrade and regeneration funding for Huddersfield Open Market. My honourable friend is right, though. While the Labour-run Kirklees Council is not investing in closing things, it's this Conservative government that is backing communities across the north.
He's not going Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, told the COVID inquiry that the now Prime Minister had not asked for advice regarding Eat Out to Help Out. But on the 9th of March 2 years ago, the Prime Minister told this House that, and I quote, "At all steps in the crisis, we have taken the advice of our scientific advisers." Who's right?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, there is an ongoing statutory inquiry into COVID. It's absolutely right that that process is followed. I look forward to providing my own evidence in the coming weeks and addressing all these questions. But it was the case that the government took advice from scientific advisers, and again, that's exactly what this inquiry will go over.
Mr. Speaker, since I recently shared my own experience of birth trauma in this chamber, I've been inundated with mums writing to me from across the UK to share their stories. I received a concerning email last week from a Staffordshire mother who'd like me to raise her concerns about Royal Stoke University Hospital. She also experienced birth trauma and has been told that due to the time elapsed, they will not be able to investigate her concerns. It is not acceptable to me that my constituents are not having complaints investigated by my local hospital. So can I ask the Prime Minister to urgently meet with me to discuss this? And can I also ask him to include birth trauma in the refreshed update to the Women's Health Strategy? We must do better to provide aftercare to all mothers in this country.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue and for continuing to be a fantastic campaigner on birth trauma. I'm pleased that the first ever debate in Parliament on birth trauma was held recently in October. It was powerful, it was moving, and it highlighted just what a significant impact birth trauma can have on so many women's lives. The Department for Health are working with NHS England to make sure that we can improve maternity care and making sure that mental health care is also improved to deal with this. And I will ensure that the Health Secretary meets with my honourable friend so that we can ensure that we get this right for all the women who are depending on it.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 13 years, the 6 oil and gas licensing rounds by the Tories have produced only 16 days' worth of oil and gas for the UK. Can the Prime Minister explain how doubling the number of licensing rounds will have any impact on the insanely high energy bills my constituents are facing? If he cared about energy security, jobs or the environment, he would surely be better matching the Scottish Government's £500 million investment in a just transition and providing a £400 rebate to bill payers.
Mr. Speaker, not £500 million, we're investing tens of billions of pounds in the energy transition, not least with things like carbon capture and storage, which the North Sea can play a starring role in. But it's just completely wrong. In order to have energy security, it's right to exploit the resources that we have here at home. Even the Independent Committee for Climate Change projects that we will still need oil and gas as we make the transition and in decades' time. So the question from the Honourable Lady is, are we better off getting that here at home, supporting Scottish jobs and businesses, or are we better off putting that money in the hands of foreign dictators and shipping it here with 2 or 3 times the carbon emissions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm hosting 14 Ukrainian teenage children here in the House of Commons, whose parents have been and are fighting the Russians in Ukraine. 6 of them have been orphaned. They are up in the gallery, but they will also be in the IPU room from 1 till 2:30 this afternoon. So I know it's a busy and important day, but all colleagues are welcome to drop by if they are able. So will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to the parents of these children and take this opportunity to reiterate our steadfast support for the people of Ukraine in their fight for their independence, their freedom and their nation's survival?
Well, I do join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the parents of these children and many others, but also to take the opportunity to say that whilst events in the Middle East have been dominating the headlines, I can assure my honourable friend that we and our allies are steadfast in our resolve to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to achieve victory. And that's why the Foreign Secretary visited both Kyiv and Odessa last week, confirmed the UK's continued unwavering support for the Ukraine. Putin cannot hope to outlast the incredible resolve or spirit of the Ukrainian people, and they should continue to have our support for as long as it takes.
Daniel Zeitner.
A few weeks ago, the world cringed at the Prime Minister's fawning welcome for Elon Musk.
Yep.
And this week, advertisers are fleeing Musk's platform after his latest vile outburst. So what exactly did the Prime Minister think he might learn from an unelected, super-rich individual who'd taken over a once successful organisation and plunged it into a death spiral?
Mr. Speaker, it is striking. It is striking from the honourable member from Cambridge, of all places, to absolutely not understand the importance of technology sectors and companies to the growth of our economy. Absolutely extraordinary. It actually illustrates everything that is wrong with Labour's approach to our economy, Mr. Speaker. What the rest of the world saw was the UK playing a lead in defining the regulations and approach to a technology that is going to transform how we live. It was a great example of the UK leading the way, an enormous tribute to our incredible entrepreneurs and businesses, many of which are being poorly represented by him and his constituents.
Today is Red Wednesday, when we remember millions of Christians and others worldwide persecuted for their faith. People like Margaret Atta, a nurse, a lovely young mother of 4, here today from Nigeria, who hid behind the altar as her church service was attacked. 100 were injured, 41 killed that day simply for being in church. Margaret lost both legs and an eye. And thousands more suffer similarly in Nigeria each year. So does the Prime Minister agree that the best way we could honour Red Wednesday today is to commit to quickly implementing the good words of the new International Development White Paper published yesterday to ensure UK development policies going forward are inclusive of those marginalised for their religion or beliefs.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her continuing dedication as my special envoy for this vital issue. Red Wednesday is an important moment to demonstrate our solidarity with Christians and all those persecuted around the world for their religion or belief. And marking this event annually was just one of the recommendations in the Bishop's report. And I'm pleased that today we will light up FCDO buildings in the UK in red in support. And I'm also pleased to say that we've taken forward all 22 recommendations in a way that we believe is making a real change for those persecuted for their religion or belief.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Before I call the Chancellor, it may help the House if I set out how proceedings on the autumn statement will unfold. Once the Chancellor has delivered his statement, copies of the resolutions relating to the statement will be made available in the Vote Office and online. I will then call the Shadow Chancellor and other honourable members to ask questions. This will follow the usual pattern for a ministerial statement. At the end of questions on the statement, the Chancellor will be called to move a motion under Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968. The question on this motion must be put without debate. We will then proceed to do the debate on the autumn statement resolutions. A minister will move the first of the resolutions and open the debate. Debate will take place over 3 days, concluding on Monday. At the end of the debate on Monday, the question on the first of the resolutions will be disposed of, and the questions on the remaining resolutions will then be taken formally without further debate. I now call the Chancellor to make the autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news. It's my wife's birthday, and unlike me, she's looking younger every year. I turn to the statement. After a global pandemic and energy crisis, we have taken difficult decisions to put our economy back on track. We've supported families with rising bills, cut borrowing and halved inflation. Rather than a recession, the economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done. Others proposed a more short-term approach, but we have not made unaffordable pay offers to the unions. We have not stopped new oil and gas exploration, and we have not increased borrowing by £28 billion a year. That would have pushed inflation up just when we need to bring it down. Instead, under this Prime Minister, we take decisions for the long term. In today's autumn statement for growth, our choice is not big government, high spending and high tax, because we know that leads to less growth, not more. Instead, we reduce debt, cut taxes and reward work. We deliver world-class education. We build domestic sustainable energy, and we back British business with 110 growth measures. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all, but well, I will if you like. But in summary, Mr. Speaker, they remove planning red tape, they speed up access to the national grid, they support entrepreneurs raising capital, they get behind our fastest growing industries, they unlock foreign direct investment, they boost productivity, they reform welfare, they level up opportunity to every corner of the country, and they cut business taxes. The Office for Budget Responsibility say that the combined impact of these measures will raise business investment, get more people into work, reduce inflation next year and increase GDP. But Conservatives also know that a dynamic economy depends on the energy and enterprise of people more than any diktats or decisions by ministers. So today's measures do not just remove barriers to investment, they reward effort and work. And I'll go through the measures in three parts. In the first, I'll use updated OBR forecasts to show the progress we're making against the Prime Minister's economic priorities. The second part sets out growth measures to back British business. Finally, I conclude with measures to make work pay. Before I start with the forecasts, I want to express my horror at the murderous attack on Israeli citizens on October the 7th and the subsequent loss of life on both sides. I will remember for the rest of my life, as I know many other honourable members will, being taken to Auschwitz by Rabbi Barry Marcus and the remarkable Holocaust Educational Trust. But I'm deeply concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in our country. So I'm announcing up to £7 million over the next 3 years for organisations like the Holocaust Education Trust to tackle anti-Semitism in schools and universities. I will also repeat the £3 million uplift to the Community Security Trust. When it comes to anti-Semitism and all forms of racism, we must never allow the clock to be turned back. I now move on to the OBR's economic and fiscal forecasts. And I thank Richard Hughes and his team for their sterling work in preparing them. 3 of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's 5 pledges at the start of the year were economic: to halve inflation, grow the economy and reduce debt. Today I can report to the House that we are delivering on all 3. Let's start with inflation. Now, the Shadow Chancellor didn't mention it in her conference speech. My conference speech was before hers, so all she had to do was a bit of copying and pasting, which I've heard she's good at. But it speaks volumes that during the worst global inflation shock for a generation, it didn't even get a mention. Well, if controlling inflation isn't a priority for Labour, it is for us. When the Prime Minister and I took office, inflation was 11.1%. Last week it fell to 4.6%. We promised to halve inflation and we have halved it. Core inflation is now lower than in nearly half the economies in the EU, and the OBR say that headline inflation will fall to 2.8% by the end of 2024 before falling to the 2% target in 2025. I will not take risks with inflation, and the OBR confirm that the measures I take today make inflation lower next year than it would otherwise have been. I thank the Independent Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee for their crucial role in bringing inflation down, and we will continue to back them to do whatever it takes until the job is done. But as we do, we will continue to support families in difficulty. And today I add 4 further measures to help with the cost of living. Firstly, for those on the lowest incomes, I understand the concern some have about the effect on work incentives of matching benefit increases to inflation. I know there's been some speculation that we would increase benefits next year by the lower October figure for inflation. But cost of living pressures remain at their most acute for the poorest families. So instead, the government has decided to increase universal credit and other benefits from next April by 6.7%, in line with September's inflation figure, an average increase of £470 for 5.5 million households next year. Vital support to those on the very lowest incomes from a compassionate Conservative government. Second, because rent can constitute more than half the living costs of private renters on the lowest incomes, I've listened closely to many colleagues, as well as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation, Citizens Advice UK, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who said that unfreezing the local housing allowance was an urgent priority. I will therefore increase the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of local market rents. This will give 1.6 million households an average of £800 of support next year. Third, although I'm going to increase duty on hand-rolling tobacco by an additional 10% above the tobacco duty escalator, I know that for many people, going to the pub has become more expensive. I've listened closely to the persuasive arguments on alcohol duties from my honourable friend for Murray and my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedsdale, fierce champions of the Scotch whisky industry. I've also listened to defenders of the great British pint, such as my right honourable friends for the Vale of Glamorgan and Buckingham, in my own constituency to Councillor Jane Austen, who is a big supporter of the Jolly Farmer pub in Bramley, and indeed to the Sun newspaper. So, as well as confirming our Brexit pubs guarantee, which means the duty on a pint is always lower than in the shops, I have decided to freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. That means no increase in duty on beer, cider, wine or spirits. Finally, pensioners. The triple lock has helped lift 250,000 older people out of poverty since it was instituted by a Conservative government in 2011. It's been a lifeline for many during a period of high inflation. There have been reports that we would uprate it by a lower amount to smooth out the effect of high public sector bonuses in July, but that would have been particularly difficult for 1 million pensioners whose only income is from the state. So instead, today, we honour our commitment to the triple lock in full. From April 24, we will increase the full new state pension by 8.5% to £221.20 a week, worth up to £900 more a year. This is one of the largest ever cash increases to the state pension, showing a Conservative government will always back our pensioners. Including today's measures, our total commitment to easing cost of living pressures has risen to £104 billion. That includes paying around half the cost of the average energy bill since last October, and amounts now to an average of £3,700 per household. We are able to do that only because we reduced the deficit by 80% ahead of the pandemic, which the party opposite might reflect on, having opposed us every step of the way. Next, I turn to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's pledge to reduce debt. Before I took difficult decisions in last year's autumn statement, debt was predicted to rise to almost 100% of GDP by the end of the forecast. Since then, the economy has outperformed expectations, and I've taken difficult decisions to reduce borrowing. As a result, headline debt is now predicted to be 94% of GDP by the end of the forecast. The OBR today forecast underlying debt will be 91.6% of GDP next year, 92.7% in 24-5, 93.2% in 26-7, before declining in the final 2 years of the forecast to 92.8% in 28-29. That is lower in every year compared to forecasts in the spring. We therefore meet our fiscal rule to have underlying debt falling as a percentage of GDP in the final year of the forecast, with double the headroom compared to the OBR's March forecast. And we will continue to have the second lowest government debt in the G7, lower than the United States, Canada, France, Italy or Japan. I turn to borrowing. The Right Honourable Lady opposite said when it comes to borrowing, she will take it up to £28 billion a year. Take it up, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, she has opposed every decision we have made to reduce our borrowing. But, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House will bring borrowing down because, as the late Lord Lawson said, borrowing is just a deferred tax on future generations. Now, I see the Leader of the Opposition shaking his head. In fact, we do have something in common. Both he and I wanted to make a Jeremy Prime Minister. In fairness, his party and mine are probably equally relieved we failed. But whereas this Jeremy is growing the economy, his Jeremy would have crashed it. And the numbers... And the numbers show the contrast. According to the OBR, borrowing is lower this year and next, and on average across the forecast by 0.7 billion every year compared to the spring budget forecast. It falls from 4.5% of GDP in 23-4 to 3%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.1% in 28-29. That means we also meet our second fiscal rule, that public sector borrowing must be below 3% of GDP, not just by the final year, but in almost every year of the forecast. Some of this improvement is from higher tax receipts from a stronger economy, but we also maintain a disciplined approach to public spending. As I set out in the spring budget, resource spending will increase by 1% a year from 25-6 in real terms, and we are sustaining the record 2020 increase in capital spending in cash terms until the end of the forecast. Within this, we will meet our NATO commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence, critical at a time of global threats to the international order, most notably from Putin's evil war in Ukraine. We also support a group of people to whom we owe our freedom, our brave veterans. I will extend national insurance relief for employers of eligible veterans for a further year and provide £10 million to support the Veterans, Places, Pathways and People programme, and I thank our excellent Veterans Minister for his championing of their cause. We have shown that we are prepared to increase funding for vital public services, with record numbers of police officers, doctors, nurses and teachers. We're nearly doubling the numbers of doctors and nurses we train, having given the NHS its first ever long-term workforce plan, as I promised to do a year ago. We're also tackling the biggest single preventable cause of mortality the NHS has to deal with by bringing forward plans for a smoke-free generation. But alongside extra funding and support, we need to see reform. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. And that is why I want the public sector to increase productivity growth by at least 0.5% a year, the level at which the size of our state starts to reduce as a proportion of GDP. I've already announced plans to cap and reduce the size of the civil service to pre-pandemic levels. Today, I pay tribute to my friend, the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury, who started our brilliant public sector productivity programme. It will now be pursued by his formidable successor, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, who has already been with me to meet police, fire and ambulance personnel to understand why bureaucracy is holding them back. And through this vital work, we will ensure that over time, the growth in public spending is lower than the growth in the economy, whilst always protecting the services the public value. And I will also provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, raising an additional £5 billion across the forecast period. My right honourable friend also promised to grow the economy. Since 2010, despite inheriting what was then the worst recession since the Second World War, Conservative administrations have presided over faster growth than many of our major competitors, including Spain, Italy, France. Well, they don't like to hear this, but let me tell them the list. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Japan. We've grown faster than all of them since 2010. But all those countries have faced a pandemic and an energy shock, and as a result, last autumn, the OBR forecast a recession in which the economy was forecast to shrink by 1.4% this year. Instead, it grew. In fact, it's grown faster than the euro area. Revised numbers from the ONS now say the economy is 1.8% larger than pre-pandemic. And looking ahead, the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. After that, growth rises to 1.4% in 25, then 1.9%, 2% and 1.7% in 28. If we want those numbers to be higher, we need higher productivity. The private sector is more productive in countries like the United States, Germany and France because it invests more on average 2 percentage points more of GDP every year. The 110 measures I take today help close that gap by boosting business investment by £20 billion a year. They do not involve borrowing more and ramping up debt, as some advocate. Instead, they unlock investment with supply-side reforms that back British business in the following areas. First, skills. No economy can prosper without investing in the potential of its people. Despite strong opposition, we took difficult decisions to reform our schools. England's 9 to 10-year-olds are now the 4th best readers in the world. And since 2015, our 15 to 16-year-olds have risen 7 places in the OECD rankings for maths, not least thanks to the efforts of the brilliant Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. But 9 million adults in England still have low basic literacy or numeracy skills. So last month, the Prime Minister set out the new Advanced British Standard to ensure all school leavers reach minimum standards in maths and English. And while the party opposite wants to reduce the number of apprentices, we want to increase them. So, following engagement with Make UK and others, I'm announcing a further £50 million of funding over the next 2 years to pilot ways to increase the number of apprentices in engineering and other key growth sectors where there are shortages. Next, planning. It takes too long. There's 110 of these measures, so just be patient, folks. I move on to planning. It takes too long to approve infrastructure projects and business planning applications. Many businesses say they would be willing to pay more if they knew their application would be approved faster. So from next year, working with the Community Secretary, I will reform the system to allow local authorities to recover the full costs of major business planning applications in return for being required to meet guaranteed faster timelines. If they fail, fees will be refunded automatically, with the application being processed free of charge. A prompt service or your money back, just as would be the case in the private sector. Now, many planning applications are for house building. The Leader of the Opposition told us he wanted to be a builder, not a blocker. It didn't last long. Just a few months later, Labour blocked reforms to the rules on nutrient neutrality, shamelessly preventing 100,000 houses from being built. Conservatives, on the other hand, are the builders, with more homes being completed in 21-22 than any single year of the last Labour government. And today we take further decisions to unlock the building of more homes. We'll invest £110 million over this year and next to deliver high-quality nutrient mitigation schemes, unlocking 40,000 homes. We'll invest £32 million to bust the planning backlog and develop fantastic new housing quarters in Cambridge, London and Leeds, which will lead to many thousands of additional dwellings. We'll allocate £450 million to the Local Authority Housing Fund to deliver 2,400 new homes, and we'll consult on a new permitted development right to allow any house to be converted into 2 flats, provided the exterior remains unaffected. It's also taking too long for clean energy businesses to access the electricity grid. So after talking to businesses such as National Grid, Octopus Energy and SSE, we today publish our full response to the Windsor Review and Connections Action Plan. These measures will cut grid access delays by 90% and offer up to £10,000 off electricity bills over 10 years for those living closest to new transmission infrastructure. Taken together, these planning and grid reforms are estimated to accelerate around £90 billion of additional business investment over the next 10 years. Next, foreign direct investment. I'm extremely grateful to Lord Harrington for his excellent report on how to increase foreign direct investment. We accept all his headline recommendations, and in particular will put in place a concierge service for large international investors, modelled on the best such services offered by our competitors, and will increase funding for the Office for Investment to deliver it. I now turn to reforms to pension funds that will increase the flow of capital going to our most promising growth companies in a way that also improves outcomes for savers. I'll take forward my Mansion House reforms, starting with measures to consolidate the industry. By 2030, the majority of workplace DC savers will have their pension pots managed in schemes over 30 billion, and by 2040, all local government pension funds will be invested in pools of 200 billion or more. I'll support the establishment of investment vehicles for pension funds to use, including through the LIFTS competition, a new growth fund run by the British Business Bank, and opening the PPF as an investment vehicle for smaller DB pension schemes. I will also consult on giving savers a legal right to require a new employer to pay pension contributions into their existing pension pot if they choose, meaning people can move to having one pension pot for life. These reforms could unlock an extra £75 billion of financing for high-growth companies by 2030 and provide an extra £1,000 a year in retirement for an average earner saving from 18. Alongside this, I'm also proposing further capital market reforms to boost the attractiveness of our markets and make sure the UK remains one of the most attractive places to start, grow and list a company. And as part of this, I will explore options for a NatWest retail share offer in the next 12 months, subject to market conditions and achieving value for money. It's time to get SID investing again. Yeah. Next, I move on to measures to support our most innovative industries. In the last decade, under Conservatives, we have grown to become the third largest technology sector in the world, double the size of Germany, 3 times the size of France, the biggest life science industry in Europe, Europe's third largest generator of renewable electricity after Germany and Norway, and the 8th largest manufacturer in the world. When it comes to tech, we know that AI will be at the heart of any future growth. I want to make sure our universities, scientists, and startups can access the compute power they need. So, building on the success of the supercomputing centres in Edinburgh and Bristol, I'll invest a further £500 million over the next 2 years to fund further innovation centres to help make us an AI powerhouse. Our creative industries already support Europe's largest film and TV sector. This year's all-Californian blockbuster Barbie was filmed in the constituency of the Honourable Member for Watford, where, of course, the sun always shines. I know that even more could be invested in visual effects if we increase the generosity of the film and high-end TV tax credits, so I'll today launch a call for evidence on how to make that happen. British-discovered vaccines and treatments saved more lives across the world during the pandemic than those from any other country, and I'm incredibly proud of our life sciences industry. To further support research and development, I'm creating a new simplified R&D tax relief, combining the existing R&D expenditure credit and SME schemes. I'll also reduce the rate at which loss-making companies are taxed within the merged scheme from 25% to 19%, and lower the threshold for the additional support for R&D intensive loss-making SMEs that I announced in the spring to 30%, benefiting a further 5,000 SMEs. And because 2028 marks the centenary of the invention of penicillin by Alexander Fleming, I'm giving £5 million to Imperial College and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust to set up a Fleming Centre to inspire the next generation of world-changing innovations. For our advanced manufacturing and green energy sectors, international investors say the biggest thing we could do is to announce a longer-term strategy for their industries. So with the Secretaries of State for Business and Trade and Energy Security and Net Zero, I'm today publishing those plans. I confirm that we'll make available £4.5 billion of support over the 5 years to 2030 to attract investment into strategic manufacturing sectors. That includes support of £2 billion for zero-emission investments in the automotive sector, something that's been warmly welcomed by Nissan and Toyota, £975 million for aerospace, building on decades of success from firms like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, and £520 million for life sciences to build on the strength of world-class British pharma companies like AstraZeneca and GSK. We'll also provide £960 million for the new Green Industries Growth Accelerator focused on offshore wind, electricity networks, nuclear, CCUS and hydrogen. These targeted investments will ensure the UK remains competitive in sectors where we're already leaders and innovative in sectors where we're not. And taken together across our fastest growing innovation sectors, this support will attract an estimated £2 billion of additional investment every year over the next decade. One of the reasons we support our manufacturing and clean energy sectors is they help to level up growth across the United Kingdom. So I now turn to further levelling up measures. In the spring, I announced we'd deliver 12 new investment zones, 12 mini Canary Wharfs, where government, industry and research institutes collaborate across the UK. Since then, the Exchequer Secretary, the Honourable Member for Grantham and Stamford, has done outstanding work across government to bring this vision to fruition. Following tenacious representations by the Honourable Member for Innis Mon, without whom a mention would mean that no Chancellor's speech was complete, and representations from the unstoppable Mayor of Tees Valley, I have today decided to extend the financial incentives for investment zones and the tax reliefs for free ports from 5 years to 10 years. I will also set up a £150 million investment opportunity fund to catalyse investment into the programme. Now, on Monday, I confirmed a new investment zone in West Yorkshire. Today, having listened to representations from the West Midlands Salesman-in-Chief Andy Street, as well as the Honourable Member for Mansfield and the Honourable Member for Bury North, I am announcing 3 further investment zones focused on advanced manufacturing in the West Midlands, East Midlands and Greater Manchester. Together, local partners expect these will help catalyse over £3 billion of private investment and 65,000 new jobs. And having listened to the Honourable Member for Wrexham and the Honourable Member for Clwyd South, I can announce a second investment zone in Wales in the fantastic region of Wrexham and Flintshire, which I will visit tomorrow. We're publishing new devolution deals with 4 areas, including Hull and East Yorkshire, and offering devolved powers to even more county areas. One of those areas will be the leafiest and most charming county in the country, namely Surrey, where, of course, the Leader of the Opposition grew up. We don't get everything right. On Monday, we saw the announcement of £1 billion of funding through round 3 of the Levelling Up Fund, supporting projects following the campaigning efforts of the members for Keighley, Dewsbury, Doncaster, Scunthorpe, and, of course, Mr. Speaker, Chorley. I can also confirm that we will proceed with over £50 million of funding for high-quality regeneration projects in communities such as Bolsover, Monmouthshire, Warrington and Eden Valley, all of which have particularly effective local MPs as their champions. And because we are proudly the Conservative and Unionist Party, I'm announcing £80 million for the new Levelling Up partnerships in Scotland, £500,000 to support the Hay Festival in Wales, and £3 million of additional funding to support the successful Tackling Paramilitarism programme in Northern Ireland. Next, small business. I ran my own one for 14 years, and I've always known that every big business was a small business once. The Federation of Small Businesses say the biggest thing I could do to help their members is end the scourge of late payments. The Procurement Act we've passed means that the 30-day payment terms, which are already set for public sector contracts, will automatically apply throughout the subcontract supply chain. But from April 24, I'll also introduce a condition that any company bidding for large government contracts should demonstrate they pay their own invoices within an average of 55 days, which will reduce progressively to 30 days. Any small business will also tell you the biggest frustration they have is the tax you pay before making a penny of profit, not least business rates. Now, the government has already taken a third of properties out of rates completely through small business rates relief. We've frozen the tax rate for the last 3 years at a cost of £14.5 billion. We've removed downwards caps from transitional relief. And for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, we've introduced a 1-year 75% discount on business rates up to £110,000. And those measures have saved the average independent shop over £20,000. It's not possible to continue with temporary support measures forever. But whilst the standard multiplier, which applies to high-value properties, will rise in line with inflation, I have today decided that we will freeze the small business multiplier for a further year. And following extensive discussions with the FSB and many colleagues in this House, I've also decided to extend the 75% business rates discount for retail, hospitality and leisure for another year. This will save the average independent pub over £12,800 next year, and at a cost of £4.3 billion is a large tax cut which recognises the role of pubs and high street shops in our communities. I thank the members for Stockton South, Barrow and Furness and East Devon for their tenacious campaigning on this issue. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I turn to the smallest of all businesses, those run by the self-employed. These are the people who literally kept our country running during the pandemic. The plumbers who fixed our boilers in lockdowns, the delivery drivers who bought us our shopping, the farmers who kept food on our plates. As part of our plans to grow the economy, I want to reform and simplify taxes paid by the self-employed. So today I'm announcing a major reform of one of those taxes. It's one most people haven't heard of, but it's a big deal for those who have to pay it. Class 2 national insurance is a flat rate compulsory charge, currently £3.45 a week, paid by self-employed people earning more than £12,570, which gives state pension entitlement. Today, after careful consideration and in recognition of the contribution made by self-employed people to our country, I can announce that we are abolishing Class 2 national insurance altogether, saving the average self-employed person £192 a year. Access to entitlements and credits will be maintained in full, and those who choose to pay voluntarily will still be able to do so. But this change simplifies and cuts tax for nearly 2 million self-employed people, whilst protecting the interest of those on the lowest pay. And because we value their work, I'm taking one further step for the self-employed. They also pay Class 4 national insurance at 9% on all earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. Today, I've decided to cut that tax by 1 percentage point to 8% from April. Taken together with the abolition of the compulsory Class 2 charge, these reforms will save around 2 million self-employed people an average of £350 a year from April. Mr. Speaker, we're backing small business by freezing their business rates, extending retail, hospitality and leisure relief, abolishing compulsory Class 2 national insurance payments and reducing Class 4 national insurance by 1 percentage point in today's autumn statement for growth. Small businesses work so hard for us, and a Conservative government today is working hard for them. I turn now to my final measure to back British business, Mr. Speaker. As I said, since 2010, we have seen the second highest growth in investment of any G7 country. However, if we're to raise productivity, we need to increase business investment further. In 2021, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced the super deduction for large businesses to further stimulate business investment. And this spring I introduced full expensing for 3 years. This means that for every £1 million a company invests, they get £250,000 off their tax bill in the very same year. The CBI, Make UK, the BCC, Energy UK and 200 other business leaders from companies including BT Openreach, Siemens and Bosch have said that making this measure permanent would be the single most transformational thing I could do for business investment and growth. The Centre for Policy Studies say it would maximise business investment, boost productivity and deliver higher levels of GDP. But because it costs £11 billion a year, I made clear that I would only do so when it was affordable. Well, with inflation halved, borrowing down and debt falling, today I deliver on that promise. I will today make full expensing permanent. That is the largest business tax cut in modern British history. It means we have not just the lowest headline corporation tax rate in the G7, but its most generous capital allowances. The OBR say this will increase annual investment by around £3 billion a year and a total of £14 billion over the forecast period. We know on this side of the House the way to back British business is not to borrow more or subsidise more, but to increase the incentives to invest. And we do that today by introducing one of the most generous tax reliefs anywhere in the world, a huge boost to British competitiveness in an autumn statement for growth. Skills, planning, infrastructure reform, pension fund reform, support for innovation industries, levelling up, backing small businesses, and full expensing. Under Labour, business investment was 9.3% of GDP in real terms. Since 2010, it's been 9.8% of GDP. But today we go further because taken together, the overall impact of today's growth measures will be to increase business investment in the UK economy by around £20 billion a year within the decade, nearly 1% of GDP at today's level. This is the biggest ever boost for business investment in modern times, a decisive step towards closing the productivity gap with other major economies, and the most effective way we can raise wages and living standards for every family in the country. Now, as well as backing business, Conservatives know you need to back the people without whose effort no business can succeed. The entrepreneur taking risks, the builder working weekends, the nurse working nights, and the job seeker leaving benefits behind. I therefore conclude with 3 further supply-side reforms designed to improve the incentives to work in a modern, dynamic economy. And I begin with welfare, and I want to start by thanking the outstanding Work and Pensions Secretary for his help in developing these reforms. He builds on the work of my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, who introduced universal credit. Those reforms helped reduce unemployment, which has fallen by over 1 million, but to their shame, the party opposite voted against them 30 times. Because they think compassion is about giving money, we think it's about giving opportunity. But post-pandemic, we still have over 7 million adults of working age, excluding students, who are not working, despite 1 million vacancies in the economy. Many can and want to work, but our system makes that too hard. In the spring budget, I announced 30 hours of free childcare for working parents of 1 to 2-year-olds. That plan, still opposed by the party opposite, starts rolling out in April. It will help tens of thousands of parents return to work without having to worry about damaging their career prospects. Today we focus on helping those with sickness or disability and the long-term unemployed. Every year, we sign off over 100,000 people onto benefits with no requirement to look for work because of sickness or disability. That waste of potential
is wrong economically and wrong morally. So with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, last week I announced our Back to Work plan. We will reform the fit note process so that treatment rather than time off becomes the default. We'll reform the work capability assessment to reflect greater flexibility and availability of home working after the pandemic. And we'll spend £1.3 billion over the next 5 years to help nearly 700,000 people with health conditions find jobs. Over 180,000 more people will be helped through the Universal Support Programme, and nearly 500,000 more people will be offered treatment for mental health conditions and employment support. Over the forecast period, the OBR judged these measures will more than halve the flow of people who are signed off work with no work search requirements. At the same time, we'll provide a further £1.3 billion of funding to offer extra help to the 300,000 people who've been unemployed for over a year without any sickness or disability. But we will ask for something in return. If after 18 months of intensive support, job seekers have not found a job, we'll roll out a programme requiring them to take part in mandatory work placement to increase their skills and improve their employability. And if they choose not to engage with the work search process for 6 months, we will close their case and stop their benefits. Taken together with the labour supply measures I announced in the spring, the OBR say we will increase the number of people in work by around 200,000 at the end of the forecast period, permanently increasing the size of the economy. Now, I know that some on the benches opposite would prefer to fill those vacancies in a different way. They hanker after a more liberal immigration regime, or even dream of bringing back free movement. But Conservatives say we should unlock the potential we have right here at home. And we do that with the biggest set of welfare reforms in a decade in today's autumn statement for growth. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we're to incentivise work, we must also tackle low pay. People who get up early, put in the hours and work hard for their families deserve to be paid fairly. Since 2010, those on the minimum wage, now the national living wage, have seen their hourly wage go up from £5.80 an hour to £10.42 an hour. That's a real terms increase of more than 20%. Because we've also doubled the threshold at which you pay tax or national insurance, their after-tax income has gone up not by 20%, but by 25% more than any other income group. Today, I confirm we'll go further and accept the Low Pay Commission recommendation to increase the national living wage by 9.8% to £11.44 an hour. That is the largest ever cash increase in the national living wage, worth up to £1,800 for a full-time worker. And since the national living wage has been introduced, the proportion of people on low pay, defined as earning less than 2/3 of national median hourly income, has halved. But at the new rate of £11.44 an hour, it delivers our manifesto commitment to eliminate low pay altogether. That means by next year, someone working full-time on the national living wage will see their real take-home after-tax pay go up not by 25%, but by 30% compared to 2010. And that is the difference. The party opposite tried to reduce poverty by tinkering with benefits and tax credits. They wanted to move people from just below the poverty line to just above it. But Conservatives know the best way to tackle poverty is through work. By reforming the welfare system, reducing workless households and tackling low pay, we have helped lift 1.7 million people out of absolute poverty since 2010, because a central part of our plan for growth is to make work pay. And so, Mr. Speaker, to the final supply-side measure in today's autumn statement for growth. Because of the difficult decisions that we've taken in the last year, today's OBR forecast shows that borrowing will be lower than forecast in the spring. Debt as a proportion of GDP will be lower than forecast in the spring. Inflation will continue to fall, and our fiscal headroom has doubled. I said I would cut taxes when we could, but only responsibly and only in a way that did not fuel inflation. The OBR today confirm I can deliver a package which does that. For businesses, I've today delivered the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, with the most competitive investment allowances of any large economy. For the self-employed, I've simplified and reformed their taxes by abolishing the compulsory Class 2 charge and cutting Class 4 national insurance. But high employment taxes on 27 million people working in the public and private sectors also disincentivise the hard work we should be encouraging. On top of income tax at 20%, they pay 12% national insurance on earnings between £12,570 and £50,270. That is a 32% marginal tax rate. If we want people to get up early in the morning, if we want them to work nights, if we want an economy where people go the extra mile and work hard, then we need to recognise that their hard work benefits us all. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cut the main 12% rate of employee national insurance. If I cut it by 1 percentage point to 11%, that would be an extra £225 in the pockets of the average worker every year. But instead, I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450. For the average nurse, it's a saving of £520. For the typical police officer, a saving of £630 every single year. And Mr. Speaker, I would normally bring in a measure like this from the start of the new tax year in April. But instead, tomorrow, I'm introducing urgent legislation to bring it in from January the 6th. So people can see the benefit in their payslips at the start of the new year. The OBR say reducing a tax on work means more people in work. And they say today's measures will, just on national insurance, will lead to the equivalent of 94,000 full-time employees in our economy, because lower tax means higher growth. And that is the difference between this side and that one. In 13 years, Labour raised taxes in every single budget, but Conservatives cut taxes when we responsibly can. And today we do just that. We cut taxes to help bigger businesses invest. We cut taxes to help smaller businesses grow. We cut taxes for the self-employed who keep our country running. And from January, we cut taxes for 27 million working people whose hard work drives our economy forward. Mr. Speaker, the best universities, the cleverest scientists, the smartest entrepreneurs have given us Europe's most innovative economy. But we can be the most prosperous too. In the face of global challenges, we've halved inflation, reduced our debt and grown our economy. As a country, we're sticking to a plan that's working, and this autumn statement for growth will attract £20 billion additional business investment a year in the next decade, bring tens of thousands of people into work and support our fastest growing industries in a package which leaves borrowing lower, debts lower and keeps inflation falling. We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s. An autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Chancellor has lifted the lid on 13 years of economic failure. We were were told that this was to be an autumn statement for growth, but the economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March. Growth revised down. Next year, the year after, and the year after that too. The Chancellor claims that the economy has turned a corner. Yet the truth is that under the Conservatives, growth has hit a dead end. What has been laid bare today is the full scale of the damage that this government has done to our economy over 13 years. And nothing that has been announced today will remotely compensate. Mortgages rising, taxes eating into wages, inflation high with prices still going up in the shops, public services on their knees, and too many families struggling to make ends meet. As the sun begins to set on this divided, out-of-touch, weak government, the only conclusion that the British people will reach is this. After 13 years of Conservatives, the economy is simply not working, and despite all the promises today, working people are still worse off. Mr. Speaker, the centrepiece of today's autumn statement is a cut in the headline rate of national insurance. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm old enough to remember when the Prime Minister wanted to put up national insurance. As recently as January last year, he said, and I quote, "We must go ahead with the increase in the health and care levy. It is progressive in that the burden falls most on those who can most afford it." Utter nonsense. It was a tax on working people, and we opposed it for that very reason. Yet again, the Prime Minister is left arguing against himself. In response to last year's autumn statement, I warned that the government was pickpocketing working people through stealth taxes. I have long argued that taxes on working people are too high. Indeed, I said in my conference speech that I want them to be lower. From their failure to uprate income tax or national insurance bans, to forcing councils to raise council tax, the Conservatives have pushed the costs of their failure onto others. But the British people won't be taken for fools. They know that what has been announced today owes more to the cynicism of a party desperate to cling onto power than the real priorities of this high-tax, low-growth Conservative government. So I think that we can forgive taxpayers for not celebrating when they see the truth behind today's announcements. Going into this statement, the government had already put in place tax increases worth the equivalent of a 10p increase in national insurance. So today's 2p cut will not remotely compensate for the tax increases already put in place by this Conservative government. The fact is that taxes will be higher at the next election than they were at the last. This is the legacy of the Conservatives, and that, Mr. Speaker, is their record. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor and Prime Minister have spent the last 2 weeks marching their MPs up a hill, only to march them down again on inheritance tax. Now, let's not forget, when they realised that they had money to spend.
I've had you chipping all the way through. Either go and get yourself that cup of tea or be quiet. Rachel.
When they realised that they had money to spend, this government's first instinct was a tax cut for millionaires. But in the end, even they realised that they couldn't get away with it in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can the Chancellor tell the House today, is cutting inheritance tax a decision delayed or a decision abandoned? This autumn statement for growth is now the 11th Conservative economic growth plan, from the 5th Prime Minister, the 7th Chancellor and the 9th Business Secretary. And what do those numbers add up to? According to the most recent GDP data, a big fat zero. That's zero growth in the most recent data in the third quarter of this year. Now, the Chancellor mentioned some countries that we are outperforming in growth, but I couldn't help notice that he failed to mention any of the many advanced economies that have grown faster than the UK. Over the last 13 years of this low-growth Conservative government, the UK languishes in the bottom third of OECD countries when it comes to growth. There are 27 OECD economies that have grown faster than us in the 13 years since 2010, including the US, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Slovenia, and 22 others. In fact, over the next 2 years, no fewer than 177 economies are forecast by the IMF to grow faster than the UK.
Sorry.
Don't bother me, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, it bothers me. I'm not being funny. I expect the same courtesies to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those who wish to not give that courtesy, please go and find something else to do, because my constituents are interested, yours aren't. Rachel Reeves.
And next year, Mr. Speaker, we are forecast to be the slowest growing economy in the whole of the G7. When it comes to economic growth, under the Tories, we are more world-following than world-beating. And let's look at how their record on growth compares to Labour's record on growth. Under the Conservatives, GDP growth has averaged 1.5% per year. But with Labour, it grew an average of 2% a year in the 13 years that we were last in office. Had the economy continued to grow at the rate it did with Labour, it would now be £150 billion bigger. So what is this government's economic record? Lower growth and higher borrowing, with debt more than doubling, now at almost 100% of GDP. This is a product of their failures over 13 years. A Tory government that has failed on growth, failed on debt, failed on levelling up, and failed on the cost of living too. And now they expect the British people to believe that when they say they are going to turn it all around, when it is them that is the problem and not the solution. Mr. Speaker, if we are going to grow the economy, we must get more people into work. Let me be clear. People who can work should work. That's why we've long argued that the work capability assessment needs replacing. Because right now it is discouraging people from seeking work. But there's a wider problem that yet again this government is failing to face up to. Britain is the only country in the G7 where the employment rate still has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, with the increase in the number of people out of the workforce due to long-term health issues costing the taxpayer a staggering £15.7 billion a year. NHS waiting lists have swelled to 7.8 million, an additional 500,000 since the Prime Minister said he was going to cut them. And 2.6 million people are out of work due to long-term sickness. A healthy nation is critical to a healthy economy. That's why Labour has pledged to cut hospital waiting lists, investing an additional £1.1 billion a year to deliver 2 million more appointments, scans and operations. It will be funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status and replacing it with a modern scheme for people who are genuinely living in the UK for short periods. But once again, we see that this policy has been vetoed by the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the best way to get people back to work is to get our NHS working, but the reality is you can never trust the Tories with our NHS. Now, the Chancellor has made a great fanfare about public sector efficiency and value for money. This is from a government that has blown £140 million on a discredited Rwanda scheme and yet are not able to send a single asylum seeker there. £7.2 billion money lost on fraud during the pandemic, all those cheques signed up by the former Chancellor, the current Prime Minister. £8.7 billion on PPE that's been written off. HS2 costing £57 billion with not a single piece of track going north of Birmingham. No one can trust the Tories with taxpayers' money. And it says it all, that after 13 years of Tory government, there are still nearly 12,000 NHS computers running on outdated software that's vulnerable to cyber attacks. 10 years ago, when he was Health Secretary, the now Chancellor promised a paperless NHS by 2018. Yet today, in 2023, 26 NHS trusts are still using fax machines. Now, why on earth should people who experience deteriorating public services under this Conservative government trust them to fix it, when his 6 years as Health Secretary makes him one of the biggest architects of failure? If you put your hands into people's pockets and take money out of them, and they don't see visible improvements in the services that they receive, they get very angry indeed. Not my words, the Chancellor's words 2 years ago. And I agree with him. The Tories have had 13 years to improve public services, and they have failed. Mr. Speaker, this is too little and too late. I do want to welcome the Chancellor's announcement today of additional funding to tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to keep our communities safe, as well as the additional money for the Holocaust Educational Trust. There is no place for hate in our society, and I know that across the House we will work together to eliminate it. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor calls this an autumn statement for growth, but it is Labour who has led the agenda on growth. And today we see the Conservatives have released their own poor cover version of what we have already announced. The Chancellor today is talking about unlocking capital by reforming pensions. But Labour would go further, encouraging investment into British start-up firms and scale-up firms, and introducing measures to ensure the consolidation of pension funds, so that our pension system gets better returns for savers and for the UK economy. On planning, the Conservatives are following Labour's lead on providing money off bills for communities that host grid infrastructure and speeding up planning decisions. What's taken them so long? Labour will get Britain building again, with a once-in-a-generation set of reforms to accelerate the building of our country's national infrastructure and to build housing too. We will fast-track battery factories, our life sciences and 5G technology to grow our economy and provide good jobs in every part of our country. And we welcome the fact that the Chancellor has announced that he will make full expensing permanent, another thing that we have been calling for. But that doesn't make up for the years of uncertainty that businesses have faced, with taxes going up and down like a yo-yo. With small and medium businesses who play such a pivotal role in growing our economy, left exposed to the Tories' economic volatility. Labour's partnership with business will get our economy firing on all cylinders. That's why this week we established a new British Infrastructure Council with key investors in the UK economy, focused on unlocking private investment by addressing the delivery challenges businesses face when investing in Britain. Through Labour's new National Wealth Fund, we will work alongside the private sector to back the growth of British industries so that we can make the crucial transition to a zero-carbon economy. And for every pound of public investment, we will leverage in 3 times as much private investment, whilst also getting a return to taxpayers. Labour's plan will boost our economy, get debt falling and make working people better off. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you listen to the benches opposite, you would believe that the cost of living crisis was behind us. But inflation is still double the Bank of England's target rate. I know the importance of low and stable inflation from my time as an economist at the Bank of England. Now, it is of course welcome that the Chancellor has accepted this year's recommendations from the Low Pay Commission that we set up on the minimum wage. But the reality is, of the Conservatives' record, that average wages for working people have been held back. Under this government, real average weekly wages have increased by just 3% in 13 years, compared to a 27% increase under the last Labour government, worth an additional £120 more every week for someone going out to work every day. And today, Mr. Speaker, is Equal Pay Day. So it is also important to recognise that the living standards of working women have also been held back by a gender pay gap that I am determined to close. Now, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister say that the cost of living crisis is dealt with. Now, everything might look a little bit better 10,000 feet up in your helicopter. But down here on planet Earth, people are approaching Christmas and the year ahead with worry and trepidation. The cost of living crisis has hit us harder because Tory mismanagement has left us so exposed. 11 million UK households don't have enough savings to cover 3 weeks of living expenses if they needed it. Working families have been skating on thin ice for too long. And as their resilience has been eroded, so has our national economies. Let's not forget, it was this government that oversaw the closure of our critical gas storage facilities, which left our country more exposed to the huge fluctuations in international energy markets. While the former Prime Minister, that's 4 Prime Ministers ago, cut energy efficiency programmes leading to higher bills for homeowners. And just last year, we saw the true cost of the Conservatives when their kamikaze budget crashed the economy, leading to market turmoil, pensions put in peril and a spike in interest rates. 1.6 million families will see their mortgage deals end this year. Those remortgaging since July have seen their payments rocket by an average of £220 a month. And next year, 1.5 million families will face a similar fate. The Conservatives' economic recklessness inflicted a Tory mortgage penalty on families across the country. In Wellingborough, families with a mortgage will be expected to find an additional £190 every single month. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, homeowners face £200 more a month on their mortgage. And in the Chancellor's own constituency, but maybe not for long, families with a mortgage will see an average increase of £420 a month because of this Conservative government's economic failure. And with increased costs for landlords, and the Chancellor knows something about that as well, renters are paying a high price too. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, working people just don't have this sort of money lying around. But this is what we've come to after 13 years of Conservative government, and this is the record upon which people will judge the Conservatives at the next election. This Tory economic recklessness is not a thing of the past. The British people are still paying the price, and we say never again. Last week, Labour put forward an amendment to the King's Speech to put our fiscal lock into law. It would prevent a repeat of last year's economic horror show, and yet the Tories voted against it. It is clear that today, Labour is the party of economic and fiscal responsibility. And what have the Conservatives learnt? The Conservatives have learnt absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, the country is crying out for change. A decaying government can change its personnel, but they have failed to change the direction of our country. In 13 years, we have had 7 chancellors. You wouldn't run a business like this. And you can't run a country like it either. And the Prime Minister can't even promise that this Chancellor will be in place at the next election. Now, we've all heard the reports. When they first came together, it was the fairy tale marriage. But 1 year on, the relationship has hit the rocks. The pair have grown apart, with rumours running rife that the Prime Minister already has his eyes on someone else. But whoever this Prime Minister picks as the Chancellor, the truth is this: Britain is and will be worse off under the Conservatives. They have held back growth. They have crashed our economy, increased debt, trashed our public services, left businesses out in the cold and made life harder for working people. Our country cannot afford 5 more years of the Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, the Ravens are leaving the tower when even Saatchi and Saatchi are saying the Tories are not working. And the questions that people will be asking at the next election and after today's autumn statement are simple. Do me and my family feel better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Do our schools, our hospitals, our police, do they work better after 13 years of Conservative governments. In fact, does anything in Britain work better today than when the Conservatives came into office 13 years ago? We all know that working people are worse off under the Conservatives, with growth down, mortgages up, prices up, taxes up, debt up, and, Mr. Speaker, their time is up. It is time for change, a changed Labour Party to lead Britain and to make working people better off.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, indeed. And I'm afraid the Shadow Chancellor has shown once again that Labour has nothing credible to say on the economy. She tells the papers this morning that she will accept these measures, as you would expect from a copy and paste Shadow Chancellor. And can I say, in all sincerity, that I particularly welcome her conversion to supporting full expensing, which she actually voted against in this House. That is copying and pasting in the national interest, and we welcome it on this side of the House. She compared growth rates under Labour and the Conservatives, but she carefully omitted one fact. Labour inherited a golden legacy from the Conservatives and then proceeded to trash the economy before handing it over. And when it comes to growth, she didn't like it when I reminded her that we have grown faster under the Conservatives than any other major European economy. And she says that she is now converted to Conservative supply-side reforms on welfare. So I look forward to her voting with us on the lobbies on those. But her main policies are not supply-side. It is a demand-side boost to growth by increasing borrowing by £28 billion a year with absolutely no plans to repay it. Now, the Shadow Chief Secretary, who doesn't appear to be in his place, this morning he asked for more action on inflation. Well, the first thing Labour could do is drop their damaging inflationary plan to ramp borrowing up. Now, she talked about the NHS. And despite the fact that we've had more doctors, more nurses, we've had more patients treated in good or outstanding hospitals, again, what she didn't mention is the only place in Britain that NHS funding has been cut is Wales. Not once, but twice, with the longest hospital waits in Britain. And perhaps we should talk about what's happened after 13 years when we repaired Labour's damage. Unemployment down, poverty down, crime down, low pay down, schools funding up, NHS funding up, jobs up, growth up, because Conservatives know that lower tax is the path to higher growth, and today we make a start.
Before we don't need any shouting, thank you very much. Before I call the Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee to ask a question, I just want to make it clear to the House, because there is some confusion, that this is not the procedure that we use for a budget. This is the autumn statement. It is therefore a statement. So the point that we're at right now is the taking of questions to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Once that has concluded, then we will go on to the debate, which is speeches. So I know that I have a list of people who want to make speeches. There will be some overlap. I'm just paying attention to that. Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what a difference a year makes. We have seen a reduction in the rate of inflation from this time last year, 11.1%, down to 4.6% this month. And we heard yesterday from the Governor of the Bank of England that he is expecting inflation to return to their target over the course of the next year or so. I was interested to hear that there are 110 measures in the announcements today that will drive growth in the UK economy. I welcome the fact
that the Office for Budget Responsibility is now forecasting that